Chapter 5, Biodiversity, Species Interactions, and Population Control starts with a great core case study about the southern sea otter. I think this is a good example of the Endangered Species Act at work. Sea otters help to protect the kelp forest by eating sea urchins. Therefore, they are a keystone species. When they're gone, their loss, even though their numbers aren't super high, has a massive effect on that ecosystem. So 5.1, how do species interact? We have some of the major interactions in here. So we have competition. Resource partitioning helps to decrease competition, gets rid of overlapping niches. So we have an example here with various types of warblers in trees, and they live in different areas. Another good example is Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. And they all kind of ate different food sources. Because of that, Darwin noticed all the differences in their beaks. So we have competition. Another important interaction is predator-prey relationships. We typically see a cyclical relationship with predator and prey. Pretty much always have more prey than predators due to laws of thermodynamics and that 10% rule. And they tend to exhibit negative feedback. This science focus is nice. Probably don't know much about kelp forest. We don't have them on the East Coast. They're much more a Pacific cold water, so like off the coast of California thing. But some of the things that are threatening kelp forests, we have a loss of the keystone species like the sea otters discussed in the core case study, polluted runoff, and then warming waters. So our sea otters are making a comeback, but we still have a lot of polluted runoff, and warming waters are definitely an issue. Okay. Back to our predator-prey relationships, they can lead to coevolution. So when you have two species that the evolution of one affects the evolution of the other, and can lead to specific adaptations that either help the predators catch food or the prey avoid being eaten. Figure 5.5 shows a lot of different ways that predators and prey can, different adaptations they have. And then I've summed up the parasitism, mutualism, commensalism right here. You've talked about these before. Parasitism, one species benefits, the detriment to another. Mutualism, both species benefit. They're not doing it to help one another out. They're doing it to help themselves out, but benefits both of them at the same time. And then commensalism, one benefits and the other one isn't really affected whatsoever. All right, 5.2. Change in color of the Post-it notes is just because I ran out of that first pad. So what limits the growth of populations? A lot of really important stuff here. So population distribution patterns. Clumped, uniform, or random. Clumped is the most common. Populations tend to clump around resources and they allows for cooperation. Uniform distribution we tend to see when resources are very limited, so they'll be spread out. And then random just kind of happens. Here's an equation that you should be familiar with. Births and immigration, moving into, will increase the population, whereas death rates and emigration, exit, will decrease. We will use this in some math. When we look at the age structure of populations, we can divide them, basically you can divide a population into three major age categories: pre-reproductive, reproductive, and then post-reproductive. You always start with the youngest down to the bottom and the oldest up at the top. If the age structure is very pyramid shaped, it's going to be a fast growing population because all of those pre-reproductive individuals will come of age and be able to reproduce. If your pre-reproductive is less than the reproductive, like the one on the lower left right here, your population is going to be decreasing in size. And if it's pretty much a rectangle, then you have a pretty stable population. We'll look at a lot of these age structure diagrams when we get into human population. Limiting factors can override all other factors in terms of determining population size. So things like temperature and pH and nutrient availability, if those are not met, then the population will not be able to grow. Figure 5.13 has a nice range of tolerance diagram showing where a population, succeed most in its optimum range, but there is there's not usually one ideal spot. Or there's one ideal spot, but they can live in lots of other places. All right, so exponential growth on the left here, sometimes called a J curve. So when your population is increasing at a set rate, like 1%, 2%, etc. More often, though, we see an S curve or logistic growth, as we can see on the right, where the population starts to level off. Okay. Figure 515 does a nice job of showing that S curve, the green line, that logistic growth. Definitely know these terms: exponential growth, carrying capacity, environmental resistance. You need to be able to apply them to a population, such as the white-tailed deer, which is described in this case study. And this is one that you ought to be familiar with because white-tailed deer are definitely prevalent around here. When a carrying capacity is greatly exceeded, you get what's called dieback. So we can see that happening right here, showing reindeer on an island. Here are two terms, R-selected and K-selected, which are not in your text. Okay, they're described, but not outright stated. So R-selected species have many, many offspring, little to no parental care. Typically, might be eggs are laid and that's it. Parents are never to be seen again. Very short reproductive cycle, the maturation time is quick, and most of the offspring don't survive. Okay. Insects are a great example of R-selected species. K-selected species, such as mammals, have few offspring, there's lots of parental care, much longer reproductive cycle, maturation time is much later, and most of the offspring are going to survive. Okay, so definitely note those two terms. Then we get into some different factors that can affect population size. So density-dependent factors, things like disease, food, competition. Okay? As density of the population increases, those factors become stronger. Density-independent factors, it doesn't matter if your population is small, large, how densely populated it is. Things like weather, floods, fires, pollution can all have effects. Populations, if we look at over time what they look like, a stable population doesn't change much. Eruptive population, a good example are greenhead flies in the saltwater marshes along the coast of Massachusetts. Their population, there are pretty much no greenhead flies, and then all of a sudden in July, their population is very, very large, and then it goes back down a month later. And then cyclic, we see again in predator-prey relationships often. And like this, humans are not exempt from nature's population control. So disease is a really good example of a density-dependent factor that affects humans. Though if you think back to Black Death or the bubonic plague, it had the greatest effect in cities because people were very densely populated. All right, Chapter 5, Section 3. How do communities and ecosystems respond to changing environmental conditions? So this section is about succession. Okay? Primary succession, as we can see in this diagram, occurs when there is no soil. So we're dealing with bare rock. When islands are formed in an island arc or over a hot spot, right? That's a good example of primary succession. A parking lot that's been abandoned can be primary succession. Secondary succession occurs when soil is already present. So if after a massive fire or abandoned farmland, etc. So this diagram right here showing secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs more quickly than primary succession because of the presence of soil. And then we have some terms here which are important. Facilitation. These are species that help, facilitate. They help other species populate an area. So lichens and mosses, for example, they help to create soil that allows grasses and then shrubs to grow. Inhibition is when species prevent other species from growing. So trees will release toxins, some trees, that will kill other plants. So that way they get more resources for themselves. And then there's another term, tolerance. So large trees, they're not affected by smaller shade-tolerant trees that grow below them. Okay, so if they have high tolerance, they're not going to be as affected. Small, frequent disturbances help to increase biodiversity within an ecosystem. So disturbances are good, okay, especially if they're very small and they happen relatively often. It helps to kind of wipe out some of the weaker species or individuals or organisms, and then it creates new niches. The stability of an ecosystem really revolves around two things: persistence and resilience. Persistence is the ability to avoid change, and then resilience is the ability to recover from the change, typically via secondary succession. And that's pretty much what you need to know for Chapter 5.